Okay.
Well, hello, good morning. I am here
Hello.
with Erin Frankie. And before we get started, Erin, I would just like to ask you to give your consent to record this conversation.
I agree.
Thank you. It's not going to be shared, it is only for academic purposes, but still. So I am here with Erin Frankie. She is my sister, but I actually chose her for this project because Erin is an environmental economist, but she works running a company, managing a company called Eco Migrations, which does adventure and wilderness travel in Baja California. So I thought she is somebody who could find this information interesting and possibly valuable to be able to share with travelers, customers, and even just as something that she is so close to. So there are two broad categories of environmental ethics. Okay, one is you can sort of think of as enlightened self-interest, right?
Uh-huh.
So it's still very much based on like
Mm.
humans, like for humans to be able to continue to have this natural environment, we should be smarter in how we use natural resources so that they don't run out, so that we don't ruin all of the wild areas, so that we don't, send into extinction all of these beautiful species. So that's
Very utilitarian still.
exactly. And then there is a different category, which is all about how we value the world. Like, whales in and of themselves deserve to live and deserve to have a home and their food and, their natural space, for example, right? And that one's based, like, literally, we would have to change how morally and culturally we think about these beings, right? Not
Mm.
thinking about, spaces so that we can enjoy them, but simply because these wild spaces should exist. They have an intrinsic value, right,
Mm-hmm.
in and of themselves. So,
Mm-hmm.
the first one is very much about something we call instrumental value. So,
Mm-hmm.
what does this offer to me as a human being? And the
Mm-hmm.
second one is very much about their intrinsic value. These things simply have value because they.
Mm-hmm.
And I have two quotes, one that sort of corresponds to each of them that I thought illustrated this very nicely beyond just my words. So this one is from a very interesting book called Moral Ground, which is a series of essays written by different philosophers, environmentalists, by people from many, many different cultures. There's one by Native Americans, one by the Inuit. So very interesting because it offers you all of these different perspectives. Each one is very short essays. So this one is from one that is by a man called Derek Jensen. And it says any solution that does not place the well being of non humans and indeed the natural world, which is the real world, at the center of its moral, practic, and realistic considerations is neither moral, practical, or realistic. Right? So this one is very much obviously the second one, right?
The
These
second one. Uh-huh.
right? And saying, you know, it's the real world, like we're just living in it. Right? Everybody
Uh-huh.
else has as much of a right to it as we do, and it has nothing to do with us. Like we shouldn't be taking care of it for us. We should just sort of be respecting nature and its existence.
Uh-huh.
And then the second one is this one, which is very interesting. Again, from the same book, but by a philosopher called Alan Weissman. And he proposes basically that the only way we're going to get people to behave differently is using human reasons, right? Like for purely selfish reasons, everyone alive has a stake in fixing what ails the planet right now because the future is already upon us. Our own personal survival is at play here.
Uh-huh.
So here
Okay.
I would like to ask you if you identify
Uh,
with one or the other more. I'm sure,
mm.
but at this moment, does one of these resonate more with you?
I would definitely have to say the second one, the moral and cultural transformation. Yeah.
Right. Can I ask why? Like,
Um, just feel like in some of the work we've done out there with whales and spending time out there and stuff, you get to see and you learn about these animals and they have culture and they have like strong family ties. And how is that any different from us, right? Like they will mourn their dead and stuff. So why shouldn't they have a space in this world, right? Like we shouldn't value like some ties and some cultures other than more than others. And so I don't know, like whales, they have culture, they have songs that evolve over generations, they remember things, the matriarchs teach others, they have like close social bonds. So of course I think they should have, I think, yeah, I think they have a right to be here and we would all be the richer for it, like if they were abundant and healthy and yeah.
that's beautiful. I head into like the next sort of description of the more specific, I want to start with this because it's sort of, you can think about this before you hear that. So can you think of a situation where you would justify harming an individual animal or plant?
I mean, for example, if it were sick and it were gonna like infect others, for example, I guess I could justify like harming, like ripping up that plant, killing that animal, for example.
Okay, interesting. Yes, and that's I think a very like educated standpoint, like a very environmental standpoint.
Uh-huh.
So you know how I told you there was basically two broad categories. So now I'm going to break it down a little bit further, right?
Uh-huh.
First one that we talked about, where we were talking about instrumental value and how we
Uh-huh.
use things. That's something that in environmental ethics we call anthropocentrism, right?
Okay.
Value nature based on its benefit to humans.
Uh-huh.
And here there are two different categories, right? One is a strong anthropocentrism, and that one is all about like economic well-being and short-term value. Like, how can I use this and what benefit can I obtain from it? And sort of from a point that as a more evolved species, we are entitled to do this, right? Because evolution has taken us to this point, and that's, again, I'm not saying I agree with this. I am really
The
describing
most selfish version of anthropocentrism,
exactly, right? I mean, where you're
right?
just,
Yes.
I can use this, and how
I can use this for myself before someone else gets it. Mine.
exactly, exactly. And then there's something that is called weak or enlightened anthropocentrism. And this one it starts to get really interesting because, for example, I never thought I would identify with anthropocentrism. And yet this one includes aesthetic, recreational, educational, historical, scientific, and spiritual values now and for the future. So when you talk about, like, for example, it being beautiful to go out and work with the animals, or it being beautiful to go out and hike in nature and disconnect from, our everyday life and go back to this natural environment, that is a form of anthropocentrism. Interestingly.
Interesting. Okay, so when I'm looking at this, I look at what I said, for example, of the animal welfare, like the sentience, principle of equal consideration of interests, like,
Um,
but they start like merging.
I mean, there's definitely, aspects where maybe you don't identify as only one. For example,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. I was like, no, no way am I anthropocentristic. And then,
Uh-huh.
but I do value these things for that. So I guess
Uh-huh.
on some level, there is
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
uh, and then
Hola.
towards then we move towards non-anthropocentrism, which starts to see value for its own sake and its intrinsic value.
Uh-huh.
Start with something called zoocentrism,
Uh-huh.
harming other animals. So not harming non-human animals. Okay? And
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
this has sort of two branches. One is called animal welfare, which precisely has to do with what you were describing right now, whales of sentience. Like these are animals that feel fear, feel pain, feel a sense of belonging, have these feelings, right? Um, and so, we should be considering their interests. Now,
Uh-huh.
the thing about this principle of equal consideration of interests, it doesn't mean that you are always going to decide to not harm or to harm this animal. It just means that you should consider the animal's rights as much as you would consider your own.
Mm-hmm.
And you might, the balance might tip towards humans, or the balance might tip towards these non-human animals, but considering them both on an equal level.
Uh-huh.
And then there's this principle that's called speciesism, right? Where it basically says that humans favor other humans.
Humans.
So they are speciesists.
Uh-huh.
And so what it does is reject that.
Uh-huh.
Singer is the philosopher who is sort of at the heart of this branch of ethics. And then
Of this idea of speciesism?
of this idea of animal welfare.
Okay.
And then there's animal rights, which is
Uh-huh.
by Tom Regan, or I guess was led by Tom Regan. And this is a little bit more radical. Okay, it basically says, any subject that experiences life has an inherent worth and the right to not be harmed.
Mm-hmm.
But it starts, you start to think about this and it starts to get very, very interesting because then, you are saying basically that all animals have the same rights as humans,
Mm-hmm.
which starts to be a slippery slope, in my opinion, right?
Uh-huh.
Once you start to say that, then, then you should not be eating beef. Then you should not be, in most senses, probably even like chicken eggs or,
Milk.
milk.
Using Mosquito repellent.
Exactly, because these animals, maybe shouldn't be held in captivity, or at very, very least, like you should be very, very, very aware of the conditions under which these animals are being kept, right? And then, you start to, where do you draw the line, right? If there are ants in your house, like, is it okay to kill those ants or not? Like, is it okay
Uh,
to have a dog or a cat as a pet? Like, is that animal's free will being respected? I mean, once you go sort of to that extreme, like it really starts to make you question everything about
uh,
other animals and where, harm might be brought to these, right?
uh,
Um, anyway, I'm not to like, really harp on this or try to, steer you in any way. So that's basically what zoocentrism is. And
uh-huh.
then we go towards biocentrism. Again, starts to get really interesting because then it's all beings, whether they are sentient or not sentient, and it also considers animals and plants at the individual level.
Level.
So, this definitely, like, it's not like, oh, like you said, this plant is now sick, so, I don't want this to spread, so I'm going to eliminate it. Or, even like this animal is suffering, like this animal either has a sickness or maybe was, in
Of
some way,
course.
or I don't know, something that caused it harm, and I'm going to, you know, like it's, very much about everything having sort of equal rights. Like don't cut down any tree, again, like talking about that slippery slope.
Hmm.
Corn, like, if you're not going to harm any plant or animal, can you eat corn? Can you eat,
Yeah.
it starts to, and like it's like everything. You have to be careful to not take it to extremes, but it does start to get into a point where, what's that line?
Yeah, exactly. Can you do agriculture? Can you like move the earth if you might like damage something too? Yes, it starts.
And then there's the one called ecocentrism.
Uh-huh.
It considers biological wholes rather than individuals, and it considers ecological and evolutionary processes.
Uh-huh.
For example, you mentioned the word culling, right?
Ah.
Example saying like, this species is out of control. Like it is now starting to destroy, plants, animals, something, right? So in
Ah.
parks, national parks and things like deer can get out of control. And so, they open up a season to hunt so that those can be reduced and people can take advantage of these animals for, feeding their families, obviously also for sport, but hopefully at the end of the day, that animal is being, used
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
right way. Um, but here it considers, if an invasive species, if it might be best to remove that species. Instead of thinking,
Uh-huh.
oh, poor horny toad deserves to live, we will let it live.
Uh-huh.
It ends up
Uh-huh.
destroying an environment or killing many other animals. This individual
Mhm.
toad has rights, and I will let it live. Right. So ecocentrism is much more about, as it says, ecology, right, and considering
Uh-huh.
environmental wholes.
Uh-huh.
So now, sort of after introducing you to these principles, I
Uh-huh.
you what you identify with. And I mean, great if it's one, but if it could be more than one. Like there could be, I think, situations.
Uh-huh. I think there could be situations. I think I would have to identify with animal welfare,
Okay.
like the rejection of speciesism. I like often wondered if that word actually like existed. So it's interesting to know that there's like a whole like concept and I can actually use it out there. Um, even in things like the use of the beach where we walk our dogs, like some people are like, you can only do it with like dogs on the leash, and I'm like, well, come on, like, it's a beach. Shouldn't dogs also be able to run here and have some fun here? Anyway, tiny small example. And ecocentrism, because I think the consideration of like biological processes of a bigger environment is so much more important than like individual at the individual level. I think that's a little bit very like perhaps Buddhist and it's like, but quite impractical.